Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you to the organizers of the 2024 IEEE International Communications Conference for extending me an invitation to speak with you. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you here in Denver. And in just a few days, the FCC will officially be 90 years old. So there's actually a couple of big celebrations of birthdays this week. On June 19th exactly, the Commission will turn 90 years old. So, if you will please bear with me for a few moments, I'd like to set the stage from a historical perspective. I think you'll soon see the symbiotic relationship between technology and regulation and the need for both to create the right regulatory environment for innovation and technology advancement. The FCC was established by the Communications Act of 1934. The Act vested the FCC with broad authority to regulate interstate and international communication by wire and radio. The initial organization of the FCC consisted of 3 divisions. Now we have multiple bureaus and offices responsible for daily activities at the FCC. Back in the early 20s, the broadcasting, telegraph, and telephone services were in need of regulation. The FCC was specifically tasked with allocating radio frequencies and issuing licenses, enforcing the regulations, and promoting competition and innovation in the communications sector. The FCC's formation was in a response to the need for a centralized regulatory body to oversee and coordinate the rapidly growing communications industry, which was experiencing significant technological advancement and increasing commercialization. For example, Congress passed the Radio Act of 1912, many years before the FCC was created, the first regulation on all radio transmission in the United States. The Act focused on maritime radio, prompted by the Titanic disaster earlier in the year, and put the power of regulation squarely in the hands of the Secretary of Commerce. Commercial advances in technologies would soon outpace regulation, however. I guess you could say radio broadcasting was the wireless killer app of the day. The Commerce Department's Bureau of Navigation, let's let that soak in, the Bureau of Navigation, served as the licensing agency of the day and issued the first radio broadcast license to KDKA on October 27, 1920. For those that aren't familiar with KDKA, it's a broadcasting station that's still in operation today in the Pittsburgh market. Indeed, the call letters KDKA were assigned from a roster maintained by the Navigation Bureau to provide identification for ships and marine shore stations, these being the only regular services in operation at that time under a formal license by the federal government. KDKA was simply the next set of call letters on the roster. Nearly a decade after the Act, the Interdepartment Advisory Committee on Radio Broadcasting was established in 1922 by the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. It was later named the Interdepartment Radio Advisory Committee, or IRAC, and it's still chartered today. In fact, the 2084th meeting will happen tomorrow in D.C. at the Department of Commerce. This is the longest standing advisory committee in the United States, to my knowledge, and it still provides recommendations to NTIA on federal spectrum access. I hope you're still with me. There's more to the story. In 1927, President Coolidge signed into law the Radio Act of 1927 that established the Federal Radio Commission to regulate the use of all radio frequency in the United States because the 1912 Act was found to lack sufficient oversight, especially for regulating radio broadcasting stations. In its first report on July 1st, 1927, the FRC explained how it had a major problem on its hands. Here's an excerpt from their first report. Bear with me. It's very important to understand the relationship between regulation at that time and technology advancements and how that parlays into what we are dealing with today from the FCC standpoint. I quote, "With physical capacity of the available channels or wavelengths already far exceeded by the number of stations actually in operation, And with no provision in the law for federal acquisition or condemnation of broadcasting stations in order to reduce the total number, the Commission found it necessary to evolve some plan whereby, without any unconstitutional exercise of arbitrary authority, the listening public could receive more dependable broadcasting service, and whereby a gradual and orderly development could be counted on to bring about a progressive reduction in radio interference. The report went on to say that a complete new allocation of frequencies, power, and hour of operation for all existing 732 broadcasting stations to provide adequate local separation and a basis for the gradual elimination of distant interference. So why the history lesson? Because spectrum management was important then to deal with what I would dare say a widespread, even chaotic, harmful interference problem. And the approach taken by the FCC's predecessor is the same approach we take today, namely careful allocation and assignment of frequencies, using geography, power, and time of operations without being arbitrary and capricious, and in the public interest to create a regulatory environment for industry innovation. Throughout history, the FCC's played a pivotal role in shaping the development of the telecommunications industry in the U.S. Since its history in 1934, it reflects the evolving nature of the industry and the ongoing efforts to balance innovation, competition, and public interest in the provision of communication services. Today, we are regularly called upon to find a home for new technologies and innovations in an environment where physical capacity of the available channels, to some degree, is exceeded by the number of stations desiring operation. Regulations must be agile and adaptable, capable of keeping pace with the rapid evolution of technology and without hindering progress. I'll touch on 5 key areas that I believe will help to prepare a fertile regulatory environment for the development and growth of 6G. That is through planning and collaboration, spectrum availability, enabling innovation, convergence, and harmonization. Let's start with planning and collaboration. Today, spectrum-based networks that connect users to new experiences are highly complex. And the 6G world of the future is going to be even more advanced. We'll see and hear about it this week from the technology experts at this event. Networks with speeds of a terabit per second that transmit data at 1 microsecond of latency. The use cases that this may make possible are limitless. All very exciting developments. The foundation upon which 6G innovation rests is planning and collaboration, and in the digital era, collaboration is not merely a buzzword. It is the cornerstone of progress. Government, academia, industry leaders, and innovators must come together transcending geographical boundaries and ideological differences to pave the way for 6G advancement. As many in this room know, the FCC's work on spectrum management involves a number of critical partners in the federal government. National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, manages spectrum use for federal agencies. And the importance of spectrum-based services for the federal government's missions is rapidly increasing. That is why the FCC and NTIA work together to issue an updated memorandum of understanding between our agencies. This MOU strengthens collaboration between us and establishes expectations and responsibility, increases information sharing between our agencies, and facilitates long-range planning. In addition, the FCC is working very closely with NTIA on many other government agencies on the National Spectrum Strategy implementation plan that NTIA released this March, which includes commencing studies on bands in the mid-band range of spectrum. These studies will help pave the way for 6G connectivity and more efficient spectrum utilization. The National Spectrum Strategy addresses spectrum access for both private and the public sector. To continue our nation's economic growth, to maintain and improve our global competitiveness, and to support critical public services and missions, we must plan for spectrum availability for new and innovative uses to meet the growing demands. To help planning efforts at the Commission, the FCC's Technological Advisory Council, or TAC, is organized to focus on key issues affecting the development of emerging communications technologies, It is comprised of a diverse array of leading experts to support its mission of providing technical advice and recommendations to help the FCC identify important areas of innovation and develop informed technology policies. It was established in 1998, so it is not as historical as the IRAC, but it is important to the Commission's work in planning for new technological advancements. Chairwoman Rosenworcel rechartered the TAC to address three specific areas: 6G, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and advanced spectrum sharing. The next TAC meeting will be in a couple of weeks, actually, to hear updates from several working groups. The actionable recommendations from the TAC can and do lead to Commission proposals. One prominent one is the receiver spectrum management policy that was adopted by the Commission about a year ago that was formulated in the TAC in the 2015 timeframe. These recommendations are instrumental in understanding the readiness of underpinning technologies that will support the development and growth of 6G. Now let's touch on spectrum availability. Access to radio frequency spectrum is vital to meeting the demands of consumers and creating a competitive market. In that regard, the FCC has placed considerable amount of low-band, mid-band, and high-band spectrum into the marketplace. Having a mix of RF spectrum positions wireless broadband operators to offer the services and applications that consumers demand, and those demands are increasing, as you can imagine. Broad and encompassing RF spectrum portfolios are important to optimize coverage and capacity. But radio frequency propagation properties differ for various spectrum ranges. Mid-band and high-band spectrum are well suited to maximize frequency reuse and increase capacity with smaller cells and larger bandwidths. Mid-band and low-band spectrum are more conducive to coverage and better able to penetrate hard-to-reach areas such as in buildings and in industrial settings. The commonality for coverage and capacity? You have it, mid-band spectrum. As many in this room know, spectrum is scarce these days as well, and much of the usable spectrum for supporting existing operations is the available channels are already far exceeded, to borrow a phrase from the past. There is virtually no greenfield spectrum, and the demand for spectrum has never been higher. Almost every sector of our economy relies on spectrum-based services ranging from transportation to energy, finance, even entertainment, just to name a few. But, as Chairwoman Rosenworcel has indicated, we need to start considering other bands if we are going to prepare for the 6G future. With anticipated timing of the first commercial 6G deployments in 2030, there is already an urgent need for the U.S. to identify and plan for allocation of substantial amounts of new spectrum for both wide area and local use area networks for 6G. The FCC is focused on making more spectrum available, particularly in the mid-band range. For example, the auction of the 3450 to 3550 megahertz band and the 2.5 gigahertz band put valuable spectrum in the hands of operators to deploy services in urban, suburban, and rural areas. The National Spectrum Strategy Implementation Plan includes establishing a spectrum pipeline to encompass spectrum bands that are in various stages of consideration to satisfy non-federal and federal needs. The bands named in the plan are representative of our country's growing spectrum needs. On the commercial side, these bands hold opportunity for licensed and unlicensed operations, satellite and terrestrial broadband services. The FCC is actively engaged in the studies, working collaboratively with other federal agencies to develop opportunities for expanded access. 2 of the 5 bands under study, the lower 3 gigahertz band and 7 and 8 gigahertz bands, have been identified by the commercial industry as particularly promising for advanced wireless services based on their technical characteristics, back to those propagation characteristics, and coverage, and their potential for being internationally harmonized. To be sure, there are substantial federal incumbencies in these bands, and a wide range of solutions may need to be considered. We look forward to working with our federal partners to identify those solutions. And to paraphrase the chairwoman, long-term planning must be paired with short-term action in order to maintain U.S. wireless leadership. In that regard, the FCC will continue to work on our ongoing spectrum rulemakings to drive innovation and spectrum policy. We just recently established in the FCC a spectrum steering team that will meet regularly to perform this task more effectively. Let's turn now to enabling innovation. There are three key drivers behind innovation and development in the wireless industry: maximum flexibility, assured spectrum access, and minimal technical and operational constraints. Firstly, there needs to be maximum flexibility. The industry seeks to expand their networks and innovate in response to consumer demands. Again, we have very high demands on these networks. Anticipating the emergence of new applications without knowing exactly what they'll be. We still don't know what the killer app is going to be for 6G. We still haven't quite defined what 6G will be. So by having access to a flexible and diverse spectrum portfolio, industry can adapt more easily to emerging trends and capitalize on shifts in consumer preferences. Secondly, consumers expect instantaneous connections and seamless communication at all times. We're always on. Your phones are on right now. We probably have 6 or 7 wireless devices on our person right now communicating with some network that is within reach. To ensure this level of service quality, industry must have confidence in their ability to access the spectrum when their customers need it most. In today's fast-paced world, industry requires uninterrupted connections with their subscribers to maintain reliable networks and manage growth in their networks. Thirdly, fewer restrictions placed on wireless networks. The fewer restrictions, the faster they can adapt and respond to the changing market conditions. If industry has limited availability or suboptimal conditions imposed upon them, it becomes more challenging and costly for them to deploy their networks with peak efficiencies. Ultimately, the public suffers, we suffer, the consequences of reduced affordability and accessibility due to network constraints. The FCC has assigned significant amounts of exclusive use spectrum centered around maximizing those three things: flexibility, assured spectrum access, and minimizing constraints on the wireless providers. The reality is, though, there are becoming fewer and fewer opportunities for exclusive spectrum use, particularly in the mid-band spectrum. But we're not giving our pursuit up for additional mid-band exclusive use spectrum. Making more spectrum available means more than just finding new bands. It means taking advantage of technological innovations and spectrum management techniques to improve potential disparate uses to be able to coexist. The U.S. has long been a global leader in innovative spectrum policy because, to quote Chairwoman Rosenworcel, when the going gets tough, we get creative. Dynamic spectrum sharing is crucial to be considered in a regulatory framework for 6G technology innovation. It allows more efficient use of the radio frequency spectrum by enabling different wireless technologies to share spectrum based on factors such as frequency, geography, power, and time of operation. Sound familiar? The spectrum access system in CBRS is a good example. New spectrum users are licensed and general authorized access operators dynamically share the spectrum with incumbent operators using all shared approaches: frequency, geography, power, and time. The Commission continually works with industry and federal stakeholders to refine the technical and operating environment to gain efficiencies while protecting incumbents from harmful interference. There's more that could be done here, though, as well, and just stay tuned. The Commission also expanded unlicensed use in 1,200 megahertz of spectrum in the 6 gigahertz mid-band range. That unanimous decision by the Commission ushered in Wi-Fi 6E, set the stage for upcoming Wi-Fi 7, and played a major role in the growth of the Internet of Things. Earlier this year, we, OET in fact, approved commercial automatic frequency coordination operations, or AFCs, in the 6 gigahertz band to promote dynamic sharing between incumbent licensees and unlicensed operations. By embracing dynamic sharing, regulators can unlock the full potential of radio frequency spectrum and pave the way for seamless integration of diverse wireless technologies in the 6G ecosystem, ultimately enabling more robust, flexible, and scalable wireless networks for the future. And now to touch a little on convergence. Regulatory frameworks should encourage infrastructure sharing and collaboration among network operators to accelerate converged networks and reduce deployment costs. This includes promoting initiatives such as network sharing agreements, infrastructure pooling, and open access models. We are preparing for the coming convergence of satellite and terrestrial communications in 6G, and we call that the single network future, because we believe next generation communications will combine traditional ground-based airwaves with satellite signals. By embracing the concept of a single network future and implementing regulatory measures to support network convergence, regulators can foster innovation, competition, and investment in 6G technology while delivering seamless connectivity and enhanced services to users. In a single network future, disparate networks such as cellular and Wi-Fi terrestrial networks converge with satellite networks into a unified network architecture. This convergence not only builds efficiencies in network management and operations, but also it enhances users' experience by providing ubiquitous connectivity and consistent quality of service across diverse environments and devices. The FCC seeks to establish clear and transparent processes to support this future with this recently adopted supplemental coverage from space framework. Just a couple of months ago, the Commission adopted the framework that allows satellite operators collaborating with terrestrial operators to seek FCC authorization to operate space stations on certain licensed flexible use spectrum currently allocated and assigned to terrestrial operators. To quote Chairwoman Rosenworcel, this groundbreaking framework will ensure continued U.S. leadership and establish a clear and predictable regulatory approach to these partnerships in support of innovation and competition. Now let's round out the conversation with a discussion on harmonization. The 2023 World Radio Conference recently concluded, just about 6 months ago. Planning is already underway for Work 27, which will focus on requirements and spectrum allocations for IMT 2030. There's a nexus between the ITU process coming out of Work 23 and the spectrum planning process in the National Spectrum Strategy, given that both are ramping up at roughly the same time. There are ongoing global studies for regional identifications of IMT spectrum in the 7 gigahertz range of spectrum, for example. In order for research and innovation to lead commercialization and scalability, the work of standards development organizations has become increasingly important. In development for 2030, 6G will support advancements in technology such as virtual reality, augmented reality, metaverse, and artificial intelligence. The industry is in need of standardized frameworks, guidelines, and solutions to deliver optimal user experiences to consumers. IEEE SA is working to support the development of 6G technology on multiple fronts. Also, 3GPP is committed to developing 6G specifications, and there's ongoing work within many other organizations to assist with global harmonization, including ATIS, 5G Americas, the Next Generation Mobile Networks Alliance. Interoperability standards should be established to enable integration and communication among different network technologies, allowing devices to seamlessly roam between cellular, Wi-Fi, and other networks without interruption. This requires a great degree of collaboration among industry, stakeholders, regulatory bodies to develop common protocols and interfaces for network interoperability. The FCC staff, along with our colleagues in other government agencies, continue to participate in many of these organizations to support fair, impartial, balanced, and consensus-based standards development. In closing, there's no question that wireless connectivity is a big part of our daily lives. In fact, we are all here now conducting business for this event using wireless devices and networks in some form or fashion. We, wireless broadband consumers, don't necessarily care whether we connect through satellite or terrestrial means or through licensed or unlicensed networks, whether we're in an urban core, remote location, or on a farm. We depend on wireless devices and networks to connect with one another. Creating a regulatory environment to foster 6G development and growth requires a balanced approach that promotes innovation while safeguarding against potential risks of harmful interference to other spectrum users. By working together with industry stakeholders, policymakers, academia, and innovators, we can harness the full potential of 6G technology to create a better, more connected world for all. Thank you, and I hope you fully enjoy this event. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me see if we have any questions. And I might, Melissa, are you seeing any questions? I'm not seeing any, but I'll give I may not be in the right spot on the app.
It's too early.
Yeah, but I'll give and we have a mic over here. Does anybody want to forego? And I have one question for you while we see if the audience has any as well. So talked about the National Spectrum Strategy and the Spectrum Pipeline and how work is underway to identify some of these bands. One of the steps in spectrum management that the Commission pursues is spectrum assignment. Typically, particularly with flexibility, the way you assign it is through auctions. You don't have the auction authority, so right now it's not necessarily plugging the pipeline, but is that a concern, or are there going to be ways, because if you may not get the spectrum authority, or what's the thinking right now? How do you deal with that?
So it's a great question, and the chairwoman is no stranger to being vocal about the need for spectrum authority. That discussion I had in my keynote about maximum flexibility is derived and authorized through our auctioning spectrum assignments, where that flexibility, technology neutrality, and flexible operations with minimal condition can prevail. We're not standing still, though. We have several open rulemakings that involve frequency bands that are identified in the Spectrum Pipeline Implementation Plan. To name a couple of them: 37 gigahertz, the lower 37 from 37.0 to 30.6 gigahertz. That's a band for a potential opportunity to act quickly, and we're moving. We have an open rulemaking, in fact, where we're going to look to see what the possibilities are in getting greater frequency use there. No need for spectrum auction authority to pursue that. Also in the 5 gigahertz band, 5030 to 5091, it's a predominant and globally harmonized band in the ITU for UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. There's an open commission rulemaking there as well to pursue command and control operations for UAVs. There's also another frequency band in the 18 gigahertz range that is devoted more towards fixed satellite services, expanding fixed satellite use in that spectrum. So there are multiple areas where the Commission is moving full steam ahead, even though the auction authority isn't there yet for some of the mobile broadband services.
I have one more question. I can't.
Here's one question.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Okay. Hong Wei Zhang from Iowa State University. Thanks for sharing this long-range perspective of many exciting topics. So you mentioned policy and technology, right? And I understand that at FCC there has been some effort, kind of tech-focused policies and so on. There's also those efforts that focus on services and operations. For example, in the past decades, there are all sorts of programs targeting the rural America, right? Investment there. There's also the emerging Rural 5G Fund. So my question is, are there any mechanisms that actually correlate the tech-focused policies and also those policies and programs that focus on operation and services? And have we looked at ways to synergize across these different dimensions? Because I feel there's actually good opportunity there, or some of the new emerging paradigms being shaped up right now.
I think I heard a couple things in your question about convergence and getting services out more uniformly to rural, suburban, as well as urban areas. And it comes down to what I refer to in my remarks about converged networks and spectrum availability to increase capacity in those areas where there's already congested RF environment, but in the areas where there are more rural settings and trying to get the bits out to those that are in more remote locations. We've got a couple of things that are working for us from an FCC spectrum policy standpoint. One is the low band and mid band spectrum, focusing in on trying to get greater deployment in the spectrum roughly below the 6 gigahertz range to get that greater reach when it comes to reaching those, being able to go out further from a coverage standpoint and having lower costs on the network infrastructure that's needed to get to those remote locations. But also from a satellite perspective, we're seeing very remarkable strides from a satellite perspective. In fact, we just opened up the Space Bureau for Business in the FCC a little bit more than a year ago, and the satellite industry is going gangbusters on trying to create an environment where coverage from satellite is not just more available from a coverage standpoint, but getting greater data availability through maximizing the power levels that could be, the PFD levels that could be achievable on the ground without causing harmful interference to incumbent users in that same band of spectrum. So trying to reach those hard-to-reach areas through different network architectures is also something the Commission is focusing on to normalize, make more uniform the availability of broadband services throughout the United States.
Does anybody else in the audience, we have right here the mic, does anybody, oh, there's one, okay.
Hi, thank you for your thoughts. My name is Maria Zeleva from University at Albany and also Spectrum X. So my question is, you talked about the history and the legacy that you sit on. And so there is a lot of legacy technology models, assumptions that new policy has to deal with. How do you manage that, right? For example, devices that were designed with much lower assumption of interference that they're going to have to face are now facing serious, interference today because they were designed 30, 40 years ago. So how do we deal with that?
So that's a great question, and in fact, we deal with it delicately, I'll put it. And the first thing we look at is trying to understand what those legacy operations look like from a technical and operational perspective. And you're right, a lot of that legacy equipment might have been, I would say, even beyond 30 years old. In the, like KDKA that I mentioned, it's still operational from the 1920s using the same AM band of spectrum that was made available by the Federal Radio Commission in 1927. So technology stays. When it works well, you don't fix it, right? So I guess is the mantra. But how do you deal with it? You try to understand as clearly as possible what the technical and operational characteristics are of that incumbent service, that legacy service, so that you can find ways, find solutions to work around them where you can, right? Back to our Spectrum Auction Authority, part of the Spectrum Auction Authority is to compensate for relocation of those incumbent services to new frequency bands so that it opens up more spectrum for new services to come in. That it doesn't stop there, though. A relocation can't happen in all cases. Sometimes you have to work around them, and that dynamic spectrum sharing opportunity that I was referring to, where you look at frequency, geography, power, and time, is becoming more and more important. So if you fully understand the characteristics of the legacy system, including the receiver characteristics, this is becoming more and more important as well. The receivers, as you mentioned, the legacy receivers, have been there for a while. The neighbors in that spectrum have changed, or are about to change, pretty dramatically when it comes to affecting the RF environment. So if a receiver, for example, was designed to operate in a particular frequency band where it was satellite operations, downlink operations next to it, that's a rather quiet environment for a receiver to build and grow. But as the spectrum environment becomes more and more congested and you have higher power transmitters getting closer and closer to where those legacy receivers are, it is very instrumental in trying to understand what those characteristics are before we embark on the art of the possible from a dynamic sharing perspective. So very key points, understanding the legacy systems characteristics precisely so that we can define what the art of the possible might be in the form of dynamic spectrum sharing and working transition plans out if necessary.
Okay. I think I want to give you a certificate here of appreciation here for, let me shake your hand.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.